Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. The situation in Ethiopia has continued to escalate. There are accusations of genocide, warnings of famine, and threats of sanctions. What began as a war between the TPLF in Tigray and the Ethiopian government is spilling into neighboring regions as the TPLF appears to launch more offensives in the Afar and Amhara regions. The growing violence threatens to destabilize Ethiopia, Africa's second most populous country, and the Greater Horn region should it continue unabated. To help us understand what's happening inside the country, I'm joined by Brook Abdu, an Ethiopian journalist and a senior editor at The Reporter. Brook, welcome.
Nice to be on the show.
Before we get started, I just want to remind our viewers to make sure they hit the subscribe button if they aren't already subscribed, and that you can also listen to every episode of Rania Khalek Dispatches anywhere you get podcasts. And for those who are listening, you can watch every episode on the Breakthrough News YouTube channel. Just make sure you subscribe. Now to the topic at hand. Brook, can you start by telling our listeners and viewers what is the situation on the ground today? Who is fighting who? Where are they fighting and why?
Well, thank you very much for having me, Rania. This is a very good opportunity for me to tell you what's happening on the ground in Tigray and around the country. So the issue is, since the federal government announced the ceasefire in Tigray region and withdrew from the towns in the Tigray region, fighting has been continuing towards the southern part of the regional government, towards the Amhara region. So currently we're seeing a wide-ranging fighting between the TPLF forces and those from the southern side of that region. That means from the Amhara regional state. So forces have been mobilized from various parts of the country, including special forces and police forces from the remaining 8 regions in the country, that is from the southern, from the eastern parts, from the western parts, and from the central parts of the country. So the fighting currently is going on around the boundaries between the Amhara regional government and the Tigray regional government. Also, on the other side, there is also another region that borders with the Tigray regional government, that is the Afar region. Fighting is also going on between the borderlines between the Afar region and the Tigray regional government. So the advances are being made by the Tigray regional government towards these regions, and since the federal government withdrew from Tigray region and announced the ceasefire, currently the federal government is not directly engaging in the fighting as the military officials and spokespeople are telling us. But the fighting currently is going between the special forces of these regional governments and the Tigrayan forces.
That's a very good point, because as you mentioned, the government had announced this unilateral ceasefire, and the TPLF continued the fighting, like you mentioned, in these regions. So I'm curious, you kind of mentioned it a little bit, but can you speak to how these regions are responding to this offensive? I saw that the civilian leader of Afar had told the citizens to use their arms against the TPLF, and the authorities in Amhara had told adults in the region to prepare for all-out war. It's interesting you mentioned that the federal government, at least they're saying, aren't involved in these particular battles. It's the locals. So can you talk a little bit about what that means for these regions on the ground and who is doing the fighting?
Well, actually, the forces that are being mobilized by regional governments are going to support the security forces in Amhara and Afar region that are fighting against the TPLF forces that are coming towards the Amhara and Afar regions to carry out offensives. So the offensive is primarily coming from the Tigray region, that is the forces in the Tigray region, and the fighting from this side, or the Amhara and the Afar side, is being carried out by the special forces and the police forces that are very recently getting reinforced by forces that are taken from the military and so on. So the call for mobilization by the Amhara region and the Afar region to join and fight forces that are coming in attacks to the regional towns and cities in the Amhara region is meant to avert the existential threat that these regions are facing, as they have already defined it like this. So the offensive from the TPLF forces is, as they have already told us, is meant to restore the territorial integrity of the Tigray region, which used to include some parts of currently some parts of Raya and Kobo, which had been administered under the Tigrayan government until the war between the federal government and the Tigrayan forces broke out in early November.
That's interesting. So it sounds like part of this is being done in the name of a border dispute. But, I'm curious, how is this? I want to talk about the issue of blocking of aid, because I've seen a lot of accusations flying around. So how is this escalation by the TPLF in these regions impacting the ability of international aid to get into Tigray and other areas? I mean, don't these offensives cut off the routes for aid to flow through? Because we've seen media reports in the US, at least, accusing the Ethiopian government of, preventing aid to intentionally cause famine and suffering and weaken their TPLF opponents. And I mean, this is, of course, typical of war if it's true, but I also see accusations from the Ethiopian government that the TPLF is the one to blame. And then, of course, the UN is reporting that the biggest obstacle to getting aid into Tigray as of now is this new offensive launched by the TPLF in the Afar region, which has created fighting that's making it unsafe to deliver aid. So do you see truth to any of these allegations one way or another, or perhaps it's more complicated than that?
Well, it's not just now that fighting has blocked aid that's been traveling to Tigray region, and most of these hotspots have been previously protected by the government so that aid can be transported from the center to to reach the needy ones in Tigray region. So in the past, the government has been giving protections for aid workers and their convoys to reach areas of areas where aid is required. So currently, the federal government is not present in the Tigray regional government. So the main obstacle now is on the route to enter Tigray region. So that is most of those routes have been blocked by the fighting that's going on now. So who is carrying out the offensive? The offensive is being carried out by the Tigrayan forces, who are to some extent mainly responsible for the blockade of humanitarian aid to Tigray region. So what the spokesperson of the TPLF and other people from the TPLF are saying is that they directly want to have direct access to routes that can transport aid to the needy ones in Tigray that are affected by the war. So there is no doubt that the TPLF is hindering humanitarian access to Tigray region, but actually the fighting is not going on. Is going on between the Amhara and the Afar, the Amhara and the Tigray forces, and the Afar and the Tigray forces. That means the fighting between these forces is also responsible for aid blockade. But I can say that primarily they could have opened access for aid transportation to Tigray region if the TPLF was willing. For very recently, the government has also reported that because of attacks from the TPLF, more than 170 trucks of humanitarian aid being transported to Tigray region had been stopped around Afar region. So from this we can see that there is the responsibility mainly falls on the forces in the Tigray region. So what's going on? What's going to happen, especially regarding humanitarian access to Tigray region? If this highly required humanitarian assistance is not going to reach the needy ones in Tigray region, so the crisis is going to be worse, and it's going to be more of very difficult in the future to reverse and bring the region back to its previous stance.
And, speaking of who's blocking aid and who's not, a lot of these accusations, of course, are very one-sided in the Western media. And so I want to talk a little bit about the media narrative inside Ethiopia, because in Western media, the narrative about the war is, it's being depicted as this brutal Ethiopian government committing mass atrocities under the direction of Abiy Ahmed, who is presented almost as this like dictator-like figure, and against these noble TPLF rebels. So I'm curious, what's the narrative like in Ethiopian media and in Ethiopian society? How much of the country would you estimate is behind Abiy Ahmed and the government versus how much is sympathetic to the TPLF?
Mm-hmm. Well, we've seen from the mobilization from across the country, we've seen that many people are supporting the military. Many people are providing support for the military in terms of finance, in terms of food aid, and so on. That they intend to send to the military. Well, actually, when it comes to media narratives, there is no doubt that there is a bigger gap in terms of access to information to Tigray region. So it's the local media mainly reports from what the government says. So mainly the government is setting the agenda. Well, when we come to the narratives from the Western media, I think the Western media is more of the narrative from the Western media. I think is more of skewed because of interests from different sides. For example, we have seen pressures coming from the American government, we've seen pressures coming from the European Union, and so on. So we have also seen some kind of efforts at the United Nations that wanted to undermine the efforts of the general public and the government. Actually, the people do not see the Tigrayans as people, do not see them as their enemies, but from a very, very long time, there has been a very deep entrenched resentment towards the TPLF. So the TPLF is not a favorite party for many Ethiopians, but we know that doesn't mean anything for the war. We can understand that this doesn't define what the nature of the war should be, or this doesn't tell us the atrocities that are being committed in the Tigray region. So the government in itself is saying that it wants the Tigrayan people to return to their daily life, their normal daily life, and the TPLF, on the other hand, says that in the presence of the current government and the current prime minister, they say that Ethiopia in general and Tigray in particular cannot have a peaceful life. So they wanted to remove Abiy Ahmed by any means. So that means the war is going to continue. So there is no one is giving chance for negotiations and peaceful resolution of this conflict. So I think that's the main problem that we're seeing when it comes to the Tigray war.
Mm. And on that note, so you mentioned that the TPLF, there's this deep entrenched resentment towards them. So, I mean, for those who are listening and watching, maybe they don't know exactly who the TPLF is. Can you tell me just very briefly about the history of the TPLF, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, when they ruled the country? And what is the common view of the TPLF's legacy in Ethiopia generally?
Well, the TPLF came to power through a military struggle that overthrew the Derg regime. And so after the Derg regime was overthrown, the TPLF organized three regional governments. So that and it formed the EPRDF, that is the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front. So this front is a coalition of four parties, including the TPLF, and they had five allied parties in different regions of the country that took directions from the TPLF and the core center of the EPRDF and led their regions. So during that time, the TPLF didn't have. Still now, many people have resentments toward the TPLF. The reason why many people have resentments toward the TPLF is that they even if the country registered a globally acclaimed economic growth during the leadership of the TPLF or the EPRDF, the democratic space, the media, and the human rights abuses in the country were very much concerning for both for the local and the international community. So because of that, many journalists had been subjected to exiles. Many politicians and opposition figures were sent to jails, and many were subjected to tortures and brutal handlings in prisons, many of which the government even didn't officially establish. So this was the legacy of the TPLF, and still now people have that strong feeling towards the TPLF's leadership, even if the TPLF had registered, the TPLF-led EPRDF had registered the fastest economic growth in the country, which was among the top 10 economic growths during the past 15 or 20 years around the globe.
Now, that's an interesting perspective that we certainly don't hear in the U.S. I'm curious, you mentioned it's very difficult to get information out of Tigray, but I'm curious if you can respond to this. Was the TPLF popular, at least in Tigray, before the fighting began? And do you know if they've gained popularity there in Tigray specifically since the fighting started?
Well, the TPLF was popular in the Tigray region because it was the force that mobilized the people of Tigray to fight against the brutalities of the Derg regime, and it succeeded in overthrowing this regime and establishing its own government in its own images in the country, across the country. So the TPLF was popular in Tigray region, but this doesn't mean that there are no oppositions to the TPLF. There were no oppositions to the TPLF in the Tigray region even before the war started. So because of these oppositions in the Tigray region to the TPLF, we've seen some political parties established to oppose and take part from the TPLF through elections. So we've seen some especially very recently, we've seen some new political parties emerging in the Tigray region that wanted to contest the leadership of the TPLF and take power from it. But after the war, what I clearly saw that is that many people have seen the TPLF as their shield from external threats. So because of the narratives that have been aired in Tigray region or in whatever perceptions that were taken from narratives coming from the central government. So after the war began, I can say that every Tigrayans, including many of the leadership in the opposition political parties in Tigray region, joined the fighting because of the narrative that the central government wants us to dismantle the social fabric and the integrity of the regional government as well as their sovereignty. And so because of these fears and threats, they joined the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front's fighting forces. But is it true? Well, it's arguable that they might have feared, or they might have seen some kind of threats that the federal government is not in their interest because of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's measures to dismantle the EPRDF, which was a symbol of repression in this country. So because of that, they have clearly seen some kind of threats, and the other point is that because of the merger of the EPRDF and the formation of the Prosperity Party, that is the current party led by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, because when this party was formed, the TPLF didn't join the party, so they were immediately after the formation of the Prosperity Party, the TPLF became a stronger opposition regional party in this country. So that also, I think, added to the threats that they were facing from the central government.
Can you just elaborate a little bit? You mentioned the EPRDF. Is that what it's called? Can you just remind people what you're referring to when you say that? Because you mentioned that that they saw the dismantling, Abiy Ahmed's dismantling of this group, of this coalition, as a threat. So can you just describe what that is a little bit and why dismantling it was seen as a threat to their power?
Well, the EPRDF was, as I've said earlier, it was a coalition of 4 parties. That is the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, the Oromo Democratic Party, the Amhara Democratic Party, and the Southern People's Democratic Movement. So these 4 parties formed the EPRDF. So this EPRDF was, even if the 4 parties are represented equally in the executive and the central committees of, as well as the General Assembly of the EPRDF, that is the Ethiopian People's Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, they didn't have equal power to make decisions. So that is, all in all, it was the TPLF that used to rule the whole country through these symbolic parties that represented and led different regions in this country. So when Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed came and implemented a decision that was earlier made EPRDF to merge the parties and form a single national party, so he immediately implemented that decision that was previously made by the EPRDF to merge the party into a single national party. So when the merger came into effect, the TPLF was afraid that the ideological orientation of the party is going to change. So what was the ideological orientation of the party prior to the coming to power of Abiy Ahmed was that it was revolutionary democracy. Revolutionary democracy was at the center and at the core of the EPRDF. So when Abiy Ahmed came to power, he declared that he will not pursue the revolutionary democracy ideology, and he will not even tie the party into a single ideological orientation, because he wanted to pursue a pragmatic approach in the party and the government functions. Well, many people criticize this, and it has to be criticized if people find it uncomfortable for them, or if they see that this is not the right way to do party practice or government practice. But when the EPRDF was dismantled by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and Prosperity Party was formed, the TPLF immediately withdrew from this Prosperity Party and said that it will pursue the revolutionary democracy ideology and will not join the Prosperity Party. So this is, I think, this is the main factor that widened the gap between the central government and the regional government in Tigray, and that probably played some role in the happening of the war in the northern region of the country.
I see. I'm curious, from your perspective, how divided is Ethiopian society? We know that the system is based on ethnic regions, right? So in a way that seems like a recipe for instability, much like the sectarian systems in places like Lebanon, where I am, or Iraq, mean constant conflict there. Can Ethiopians coexist under this current structure?
Well, Ethiopians have been living in the current Well, Ethiopia is a mosaic of nations and nationalities, and more than 80 languages are spoken in this country. And
Wow.
this is not an issue that has been raised by Ethiopians not to live together. Well, what Ethiopians have been demanding for a very long period of time was that equal recognition as equal members of the federation, equal status or equal economic rights, and so on. So I don't think any problem with the diversity that we have in this country. So Ethiopians, when it comes to their ethnic differences, Ethiopians were always proud of one another's cultures and so on. So you'll be amazed to see people celebrating Eritrea, or people celebrating Chambalala, or people celebrating the Mescal festival, or any kind of cultural and religious festivals in this country, and you don't see any kind of ethnic or religious differences in this celebrations. So the main thing is Ethiopians have been coexisting like this for centuries. So this is not anything that can come today and is going to dismantle the country. So what could affect the coexistence of this country is lack of democracy and lack of equal rights, equal economic or political rights, and equal representation at the center. So Ethiopians, I can say that they are united in a sense that they believe in the bigger picture of Ethiopia. That's the bigger Ethiopia. So they want to be recognized as a nation, as an ethnic group, and they also want to have equal democratic and economic rights. They want to have equal representation at the state affairs and regional affairs and so on. So the main threat, I don't see that the diversity is a threat for the country's coexistence. But if the country doesn't manage to bring about democracy and ensure equal rights, economic and political rights, that could be a threat for the country. But not, I don't see any threat coming from the diversity of the country.
Well said. Last week, I'm sure you saw, because it made quite a big splash, I interviewed my colleague Eugene Puryear about the situation in Ethiopia, and the response was interesting. We received an outpouring of gratitude, actually, from Ethiopians around the world who say they feel like this conflict is being totally misrepresented. On the other hand, we were also condemned for supporting atrocities and seemingly supporting the government's war. I'm curious what you thought about these different sentiments. I imagine you saw this playing out online to some degree.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes. Well, the issue is, you see, this war has been widely misrepresented. I believe that, because the atrocities, we all have to condemn atrocities, whoever commits them. So we also have to call for justice to be served for those victims, and we also have to call for the perpetrators of these attacks and atrocities to be brought to justice. So that should be our common ground for all of us. Whoever commits these atrocities, whoever has perpetrated these attacks, should be held accountable. So this should be the ground for all of us. But the thing is, the misrepresentation, what I see from different sides, is that, for example, if people are pro-government, they want to magnify atrocities committed by the TPLF forces or other forces. And if people are supporters of the TPLF, they magnify the atrocities committed by the government. So the government has admitted that there were members of the military who committed atrocities in Tigray region, and they were held accountable because of what they did. So we didn't hear the same thing coming out from the TPLF side. I don't know. Even I even didn't see any kind of admittance to atrocities committed by the TPLF. I don't know if I missed out anything from that. But the point is that the misrepresentation of this war is obvious for all of us. So the government is not providing enough information for the people to rely on and to make these decisions. The media is not also getting enough access of information to Tigray region. So because of communications, the huge amount of information that's coming out of Tigray region through the spokespeople of the TPLF, the representation of the war is more of inclined towards the Tigray region. So that doesn't mean that war is right or the war is wrong. No, nobody has to say that there is. I don't see there is. I can't say that there is a just war in every situation. So we should have avoided this war. I believe that we should have avoided, and we could have avoided this war had we listened to ourselves and had we sat down and discussed our differences and tried to resolve this. But after all, after the beginning of the war, there was huge blockade of information from all sides. So that has to some extent affected the balanced reporting of the war in the country. So in this regard, so there is this a well-known saying that in war the first atrocity is on truth. So you can't say So you can probably say that he said so or she said so or this side said so or that side said so, but you can't really pinpoint which one is the truth or not.
Right. And that's, I mean, I totally understand what you're saying. I live in the Middle East, and the wars, I mean, one thing is for sure, war is nasty. And once it starts, everyone commits horrible crimes. That's just the nature. There's no clean war. It doesn't work like that. Yes. We like to tell ourselves that. We like to say there's international law and there's like a just way to carry out massive violence, but it's just not the case. So I'm glad that you pointed that out. I'm curious, as a journalist who's covering this conflict and you're in Ethiopia, so how do you tell fact from fiction on both sides of this conflict, where there are so many accusations and it's almost impossible to verify? I see people saying the TPLF is using child soldiers, and then that, the government forces are committed a massacre here or there. As a journalist, is it difficult for you to cover this conflict? And on top of that, is there a nationalist fervor or any government pressure that prevents journalists from criticizing the behavior of the army at war?
Well, there's a huge gap in information. So, for example, there are accusations, as you've said, that the TPLF is using child soldiers, but we couldn't verify those unless we could travel to that region. That's a very volatile region, and cover those accusations or verify those accusations by ourselves. But the thing is, it's not just those accusations that are not being verified and being reported. It's very difficult to identify or to differentiate between facts and fiction. So for example, there are reporters that come from Tigray region that say that the government is using human wave to subdue forces in the Tigray region, but unless you go and see that kind of approaches to war in action, you can't clearly report on that. So sometimes the government is, to some extent, the military is responsive. They have the communications department that responds to questions to journalists, but you can't get the full picture of the war, the full picture of what's going on in region, and you can't really have a balanced reporting of what's going on the ground. So I think that this is a very difficult time for journalism in Ethiopia, because to some extent there are also some kind of people also want to put you in some category when you do some kind of things. For example, I've friends who had been accused of being sympathizers of this group or that group because of their reporting and so on. So it's a very difficult time, and it's very, very difficult, I can say, to verify or to differentiate between facts and fictions that come out of this war.
No, and I mean, I have to say, like, we definitely appreciate the work you're doing. I know that being a journalist in the midst of a war, not just on the ground, but of narratives, is not the easiest thing to do. I'm wondering, is it a coincidence that this conflict took place at a time when Egypt and Sudan are growing increasingly concerned about the dam on the Nile that threatens their supply of water? Because we know that Donald Trump supported Egypt and had threatened Ethiopia. I guess the question I'm asking, is there any evidence of outside support for the TPLF to undermine or distract Ethiopia? Or is it really just an internal problem?
Mm-hmm. Well, you see, for example, how did the war start? The war started because of an attack on the northern command of the Ethiopian National Defense Forces. For me, that is the immediate cause of the war. But the war has many causes. As I've said, since the merger of the EPRDF, things have been piling up, and many international and local observers have been saying that this is going to lead to war and conflict between the federal government and the Tigray regional government, and they recommended ways of avoiding this conflict. So one of these reports is made by the crisis group, which said that both governments, the regional and the federal governments, have to commit themselves for peaceful resolution of their differences in order to avoid military confrontations between them. But I mean, this conflict didn't come out of the blue, and we have a context in this. The country is building the largest dam in Africa, that is $4 billion hydroelectric dam that's being built on the Abiy River, that is the main tributary to the Nile River, that's the longest river in the world. So 86% of this water comes from Ethiopia. So the Egyptian government had previously previously said its intent of launching war on Ethiopia to stop it from building this dam. We've seen television broadcasters that say that this country should not build this dam, and the Egyptian government should use any means, including military means, to stop the dam. But when it comes to the conflict in Tigray, I don't think I have enough evidence to say that the Egyptians or the Sudanese have directly involved themselves in this war. But the thing is, when immediately after the war broke out in Tigray region, the Sudanese military seized many parts of Ethiopia, and they even declared that the area where the dam is built belongs to them. So this means that there are many interests that are playing out war in Tigray and dam. And because of the international support, especially from the United States during the Trump presidency, the Egyptians and the Sudanese people, the Egyptians and the Sudanese government has had the moral ground to claim that Ethiopia is not building this dam for the purpose of its development, but rather for political and other regional interests that it has. So we can put the war into different contexts, but I cannot directly link the war with the efforts by Egypt or Sudan to destabilize Ethiopia, but I cannot rule out that there are interests to destabilize the country because especially the Egyptian government had previously said that it doesn't want Ethiopia to build a dam and it wants to use any means to stop the country from building and utilizing this dam. So that's what I understand from this context.
No, of course. I mean, all we can do is speculate, but I imagine, years from now, we'll learn that people, when it comes to war, even if it starts organically, there's always opportunism of people, outside actors that get involved. I wanted to ask you about the elections last September, I think it was, or in September of last year, the TPLF held elections despite the federal government delaying them. So I wanted to ask you, were the elections really delayed because of coronavirus? And was it right to delay them? Because that's been something that's been discussed a lot in the media about why this war started, is the issue of these elections being delayed.
Well, the delayance of the election has played, no doubt that it has played in fueling the conflict between the TPLF and the federal government. So the preparations for the elections last year, for the 6 national elections that were conducted this year, the preparations last year were highly criticized because of various factors. For example, the National Election Board of Ethiopia was newly constituted at the time, and it was involved in internal reforms and legal and other reforms that it said would enable the board to conduct free and fair and democratic election in this country that would restore the public's trust in elections and so on. So the elections were previously intended to be conducted in 2020. So during those preparations, many people, even including the opposition politics and scholars in this country, have been saying that the country ready to conduct the election because of security issues in different parts of the country, because the country has been seeing different conflicts in various parts of the country, including in the Amhara region, in the southern region, in the Oromia region, in the Benshangul Gumuz region, and so on. So because of those conflicts, people were recommending postponing the election even before the coronavirus pandemic happened. So even if people were saying this, the National Election Board of Ethiopia, as well as the government were adamant that they will continue with the preparations of the elections, and they wanted to conduct the elections according to the constitutional provision that says that the terms of the government, the term of the government ends that year, and a new government had to be formed in September the next year. So because of this, the TPLF was not complaining about the preparations of these elections, and one of the only recommendation that came from the TPLF at the time was the schedule of the elections were pushed towards August, but they wanted to have it in May. So this was the only difference they had between the federal government and the TPLF at the time. But because of the coronavirus pandemic, well, it's arguable if the government had used the coronavirus pandemic as a pretext to extend the elections because of different factors that could not allow the country to conduct the elections. But because of the coronavirus pandemic that happened globally, the Ministry of Health and the National Election Board of Ethiopia recommended for the postponement of the election by 1 year. So this was accepted and decided by the House of the Federation, the higher chamber, and the House of People's Representatives, that's the lower chamber of the parliament. So this was not welcomed by the TPLF, and immediately the TPLF declared that the government will not be it will not recognize the government after September 25, and it will continue to hold elections in Tigray region, that is regional election. So when the TPLF held elections, it won around 99% well, we can say that it's 100% of the seats in the regional government, and the federal government declared that that election is not acceptable and it was not conducted by an entity that is legally mandated to conduct elections in this country. So this had filled and widened the gap between the two forces, the central government and the TPLF in the Tigray region. So this played into the declaration of the TPLF as a terrorist group in this country very recently, because it didn't want to abide by the rules and proclamations of the country. The House of the Federation declared the TPLF as the terrorist group. So this is what I can observe from the elections.
So actually, I wanted to ask you about that labeling of the TPLF as a terrorist organization by the government in May. Why did Abiy Ahmed do that? And you explained it a little bit, but what was the reasoning behind that? And do you think this is an accurate label? And did it help provoke the conflict further?
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know if this is right or wrong, but the thing is that the members of the House of People's Representatives, that is the parliament, have been asking for the government to declare the TPLF group as a terrorist group because of the accusations that had been coming from the federal government, that the TPLF was behind the conflicts that the country had been seeing for a very long time, especially for the 3 years since Abiy Ahmed came to power. So because of that, many people, including parliamentarians, have been asking the government to declare the TPLF as a terrorist group. So the final decision by the House of People's Representatives was made after the war was launched, and after the government announced that the TPLF attacked the northern command of the National Defense Forces. So along with the TPLF, the House of People's Representatives also led another group as a terrorist group, that is the OLF Shani group. So that group is also blamed to have conducted terrorist attacks or is engaged in military activities in the eastern part of the country. So the many factors played in the declaration or the labeling of the TPLF as a terrorist group, but the immediate factor for me is the war or the attack that was directed towards the Ethiopian National Defense Forces based in the Tigray region.
Many Western countries, I'm sure as you've seen, including the US, have condemned Ethiopia in very strong terms and accused it of everything, from committing mass rape in Tigray to genocide. And as you reported last week, Democratic Congresswoman Karen Bass said that the Ethiopian American community in the US had called for intervention in Tigray. Even though, of course, there are Ethiopian Americans that are adamantly opposed to the way that the U.S. has gone about being very one-sided in this conflict. So my question for you is there a fear in Ethiopia that this could spark Western military intervention?
Well, when you see the pressures coming from the Western government, what's left when you see the pressure coming from the Western governments and Western entities? It's only this principle called the right to protect, or sending in their military to stop the war in the country. But I think that would be politically costly for them to do that. But I don't think that they are going to send in their military. But I see that there are interests of doing or exerting any kind of pressure that they say would make the federal government succumb to their interests. But why are the Western governments as well as Western entities this much focused on Ethiopia, and why are they exerting this much pressure on the federal government because of this war in Tigray? Well, I can't say that they should. I don't want to say that they should not pressure the federal government to stop the war. And I believe that it is the federal government that primarily should be pressured to stop the war and go to the negotiation tables. But when you see the pressures coming from different sides, especially from the American government and the European Union, the interests do not seem directed towards stopping the war in Tigray only. So I think there are many interests that are in play that want in play when it comes to pressuring the government to stop the war in Tigray. Ethiopia is a very strategic country especially for the American government in terms of fighting terrorism in Somalia. You know, Ethiopia has been fighting Al-Shabaab forces in Somalia for years, and Ethiopian forces are also known for peacekeeping across the continent. So while Ethiopia is contributing this much to the stability of the region as well as the continent, how West government to see it descend to chaos itself? So I see that. I understand that they are also concerned that this country should not descend into chaos and conflict, while it's known for protecting peace and security across the continent. But the other thing is 100 million people in this country. Imagine if this country descends into conflict and 100 million people were to flee the conflicts and cross the Mediterranean or any other the Red Sea and so on. So you can see the humanitarian and the refugee crisis that's going to happen in Western countries, especially Europe and so on, Europe and the Middle East. So when you see the other side of the interests, so I don't think that the Western government, especially the Americans, currently want Ethiopia to stay stronger as it used to be, because of the delisting of Sudan, for instance, from the terrorist financing country by the US. The relationship between the Sudanese and the US government had been enhanced, and the geopolitical relevance of Ethiopia to some extent has been decreasing. So I see that the Americans want to in another regional power to replace Ethiopia rather than maintaining Ethiopia as a strong power in this region. So there are many interests in play when it comes to pressuring the country into accepting demands that are coming from the Western governments and entities.
You know, and also with the many wars in with most wars, I should say, whether we're talking about Syria or Iraq or Libya, there were always exiles pushing for intervention. And so I'm curious if you see any sort of organized effort outside of Ethiopia, but by Ethiopians to or other Africans to lobby for intervention. Or perhaps it's the other way around, because I've also seen many Ethiopian Americans pushing back against what they view as this one-sided policy by the US. So yeah, have you seen any sort of organized effort either way by exiles for or against intervention?
Well, as you've mentioned previously, there is a report that I did on the speech made by Congresswoman Karen Bass. So that shows us that there is a push from the Ethiopian community or some kind of community that is pushing for intervention by the US military to resolve the crisis in Ethiopia. But as I've indicated in my report, she didn't say that which kind of diaspora is requesting for intervention by the US military to resolve the Tigray region crisis in the country. And on the flip side of this, there are also groups that are opposing the pressure coming from the Western government, especially the US. And even immediately after that speech made by the Congresswoman, many Ethiopians met with the congresswoman and told her that her stand was not right, and the US pressure on Ethiopia was not justified by any means. So I can say that both groups are present and both groups are lobbying the US government to do their interests. But I don't think that these interests by themselves can prevent whatever the US wants us to do. For example, if the US wants us to send its troops to Ethiopia, that's going to be depending on the interests from the US side, not from the lobbyists' side.
That's very true. Yes. At the end of the day, it's U.S. interests that win out over any, lobbying group one way or another. You talked about this a little bit earlier, but I'd like for you to elaborate. Was there a way to avoid this conflict? And is there a way to end it now through some sort of compromise?
Well, it's not anytime. It's not late for peace. It's not late for peace. The conflict I believe that the conflict could have been avoided, and it should have been avoided from the outset. From the outset, I've never imagined the country to descend into conflict in my age. So, relatively, my generation lived in a country that didn't see war or conflict. So the generation before me lived in conflicts, war, and so on. So my generation was saved from, I can say that it was saved from wars, especially such kind of huge conflicts, military conflicts in the country. So now we're seeing a situation where the country is at risk of getting into a wide conflict unless this is resolved very soon. And unless the government tries to bring peaceful resolution through negotiations and so on. So I've seen reports from the government that say that the government wants us to negotiate with the relevant bodies in Tigray region to resolve the conflict. And from the beginning, the government has been saying that it didn't want to enter the war in Tigray, but wants us to apprehend people who led and directed the attack on the northern command of the federal military forces. But even if that was the narrative that's coming from the federal government, we can't say that that happened. The war ended after the government succeeded in achieving its objectives. So what I can say that the sides should sit for negotiations, and efforts to sit and negotiate between the two countries should come from internal groups like civil societies working in the country, and reconciliation and other commissions that are being set by the government to deal with such kinds of conflict. But what the country should avoid is that negotiators from the outside who will definitely come in the country with their own interests. So what I can say that in order to resolve this conflict and to avoid further atrocities, the government should take the primary initiative to negotiate with any kind of forces and bring an end to this conflict. But we have to also avoid interests from the external world that wants us to. All right, that's it.
Well, I'm curious, who is blocking efforts to find solutions? Who is blocking them internally, and are there any outside actors also blocking these efforts?
Well, the government had declared its intent to negotiate with any kind of legitimate body that wants us to bring about peaceful resolution of this conflict in the Tigray region, but the conditions that were set out by the Tigray People's Liberation Front for negotiations were like terms of negotiation rather than conditions of negotiation. You see, those pointers should have been included in the agenda of the negotiations rather than putting them as conditions of negotiation. So, ceasefire was declared by the government. That should have been taken as an initial measure for peaceful resolution, and the government also declared its intent for negotiation with any relevant body that wants us to put an end to this conflict. So the other effort that I have seen from the side of the government is that opening humanitarian access and withdrawing from Tigray region that it had been occupying for 8 months, where should also be taken as initiatives for such kind of peaceful resolution of the conflict. So what we have to see after this is that the two sides have to minimize their conditions to sit for negotiations and sit down and try at least stop the fighting for some period of time for the people to get relief from fighting and so on. So I think that's what they should do.
You had mentioned earlier the issue of accountability and that the government had actually held some people accountable for some atrocities that were committed. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, apart from holding people who committed atrocities accountable, we don't have any detail of how many people were detained and how many people were held accountable because of what kind of atrocities they committed or what kind of wrongs they did. But in general, the government had declared that it had brought people who committed crimes during the law enforcement operations in Tigray into justice. So that's the only thing that we know.
I see. And then I wanted to ask you, and I know this is all you can do is just kind of speculate here, but predictions. Can Ethiopia be put back together again? And where do you believe that this war is heading?
Well, Ethiopia, I don't think, well, there is some kind of social fabric that has been affected because of the war in Tigray. The resentment coming from the people in Tigray and the forces of the TPLF towards the Ethiopian state is worsening from time to time. And if the country could manage to bring about peaceful means of resolving this and also compensating what had been committed or the wrongs that had been done during the war in Tigray and so on, I think the country could coexist with the Tigrayan people in general. So you see, currently the war is going on between the borderlines between the Amhara region and the Tigray region and the Afar region and the Tigray region. So these people in the borderline, if you travel to those people to those areas, you can see that the people really do not have differences when it comes to culture, when it comes to language. People speak 2 or 3 languages. People wear the same thing. People eat the same things. So they are intertwined through culture and so on in many economically too. So in many aspects. So the war, unless it is resolved now, it's going to consume the country both economically and generationally. So the people, as many people join the war, you see there is an impact on the productive section of the society that's going to contribute to the economy and so on. So that's why many people are calling for the end to this conflict in the northern part of the country.
Of course. And I just have a couple more questions for you, I promise, because I know you've given me a lot of your time and I really appreciate that. And I think it's so important to be able to hear from Ethiopians themselves, especially for our very American audience. I'm curious, I haven't seen any reports about any limitations on the press in Ethiopia. So as a journalist, I mean, are there press freedoms in Ethiopia? You're free to report, however you feel is fit.
Well, you remember when Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed came to power, the country immediately improved its index in press freedom, and for the first time in the country, the World Press Freedom Day was celebrated in this country. So that was a high time for hopes for the improvement of journalism in this country. But yeah, we've seen some improvements. For example, that the government has introduced the first ever media policy that intends to help the media contribute its part to the development of the country and to help journalism be practiced in a space that allows for the journalists to do whatever they want. And also the media law was also amended. So the introduction of the policy as well as the amendment of the media law where they gave people hopes that the media environment, the space is going to be improved and so on. So, and after that, the government also introduced this law called the Hate Speech and Anti-Fake News Proclamation. That's highly feared that it would hamper the practice of journalism in this country. Also, apart from that, the access to information is still limited in this country, as I've said. For example, we have difficulties in finding information from government entities and so on. So that's still a problem in this country. And also, there is this perception that journalism in this country has to be categorized into some kind of group. You have to be cornered in order to be accepted or rejected. You see, it's not based on the objectivity that you have any reporting on or not, but it is because of perceptions from some kind of interest groups that you are supporting this group or that group. So this is also a big threat for journalism in this country that I see.
Yeah, I could actually extend that to a lot of other countries as well. I think we have a similar problem in that respect when it comes to American journalism. It is interesting, though, because from what you say, it sounds like the press freedom was far more limited when the TPLF was in power than after they were ousted from power. I guess the last thing that I would want to end on, well, actually two things, is first, what do you as an Ethiopian want Americans to understand about this conflict, if there's like one thing they can take away from this interview?
Well, what I can say is that there is no only a single group to blame because of the conflict in Tigray region. Well, it's clear that the immediate factor of the conflict is an attack by the TPLF on the northern command of the Ethiopian National Defense Forces, that the TPLF said that it was a preemptive attack because of the threats that they saw coming from the forces from the federal government. But the thing is, after the war, there were reports of atrocities, there were reports of attacks on civilians and so on. So many of these reports are not verified by independent bodies or journalists, and many of these reports coming out from Tigray region are skewed, and they are not balanced by many aspects. You can question many things of the reports that are coming out of the Tigray region. So, but what the world has to understand primarily is that help should be provided to this country in many aspects. So one of the ways that the international community could help this country come out of this conflict is that not to speak on what they don't understand. So many people are saying that they take information from one side, or they listen from people from one side, and they say many things depending on those unbalanced information that they have. So please don't say anything on things that you don't understand. And if you think that you understand, please try to say it in a way that pay or that helps the country to come out of this conflict, not in a way it can fuel the conflict.
So, Brook, I appreciate all your time and all the important in-depth information that you've given our audience. The last thing I would want to end on is where would you suggest people look to for information so they can follow this conflict? I know your outlet is one of them, so why don't you tell people about your outlet as well?
Well, information is scarce regarding the Tigray conflict, and most of the information out there is to some extent well, there are many outlets that provide balanced reporting, but many of the reporting that comes especially out of reports by Western media is not balanced, and it doesn't show the full picture of the conflict in Tigray. Local media also, there is also a problem with reporting from local media, and that one of the factors for that is the lack of information and difficulties of access to information regarding the conflict in Tigray. So because of these factors, I can say that we have difficulty in getting the full picture of the conflict in Tigray. But there are some sites or some source of information that the public can follow to learn about the Tigray conflict. Well, one of these outlets is our newspaper, that is the reporter Ethiopia.com and EthiopianReporter.com for Amharic readers. And also there are also some other local newspapers, that is Addis Fortune. Also people can also read Capital newspaper and so on. And also there are other public media outlets that report both in Amharic and in English that people can follow in order to learn more about the Tigray conflict.
Thank you so much, Brook Abdu, journalist and senior editor at The Reporter. We really appreciate you coming on and giving us so much information about this issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.